Good morning Year 6, I hope you're all alright. This is your next maths lesson, so it's the same as yesterday where it's a recap on something that you've done before. This time it's finding percentages of amounts. So if you take a quick look at the questions that are written there, pause the video, give yourself a chance to answer them and then press play when you want to see the answers. So why do we divide a quantity by 2 in order to find 50%? Well, that's because 50 is half of 100, and to find half of something we divide it by 2. How do you calculate 10% of a number mentally? Well, 10% is the same as 10 over 100 or 1/10, and when we're finding 1/10 of something we divide it by 10. And then what is the same and what is different about 10% of 300 and 10% of 30? Well, the thing that's the same is that we're doing the same method, so for each of them you are dividing it by 10. The thing that's different is obviously the final answers are different. So 10% of 300 is 30 and 10% of 30 is 3. So now we're going to move on to some fluency. So Eva says 50% is equivalent to a half. To find 50% of an amount I can divide by 2. So I want you to do the same for the sentences below. Then at the bottom it says use the bar models to help you complete the calculations. Personally, I don't think most of you need to use the bar models. I think you can use the sentences that you've written at the top in order to know which division questions or which division calculations you need to do to work out the answers to the bottom. So again, press pause and have a go. So 25% is equal to a quarter, therefore to find 25% of an amount we divide it by 4. 10% is equivalent to a tenth, so to find 10% of an amount we divide it by 10. And 1% is equivalent to 100th, so to find 1% of an amount we divide by 100. Bottom questions then, 50% of 406, if we divide it by 2 or half it, it's 203. And 25% of 124, so we divide 124 divided by 4 is 31. And to do that as well, you could just half it and half it again. So 124 half it to make 62, half it again to make 31. And then at the bottom, you've got your answers there. So 50% of 300 is 150, 50% of 30 is 15, 50% of 60 is 30, and then going across you've got your 25% answers there, 75, 7.5 and 15, 10% answers 30, 3 and 6, and your 1% answers are 3, 0.3 and 0.6. So Mo says that 10% of 220 is 22, so 30% of 220 is 3 times 22, which is 66. So basically, in order to find 30% of an amount, he's done 2 steps. He's divided it by 10, and then he's times that by 3. So it wants you to use that method to calculate the following: 40% of 220, 20% of 110, 30% of 440, and 90% of 460. Then it wants you to find 5%. It says to find 5% of a number, divide by 10, then divide it by 2. So use that method to work out those ones. And then do you know any other methods? So how else could we work out 5%? And then at the bottom, it wants you to calculate 15%, 35% and 65% of different amounts. So for those ones, you would need to find 10% first, then 5% and add them together. Find 30% and 5% and add them together. And then find 60% and 5% and add those together. Off you go. So using Mo's method then, 40% of 220, well 10% is 22, so 40% is 4 times 22, which is 88. 20% of 110, well 10% of 110 is 11, so 20% is 2 times 11, which is 22. 30% of 440, 10% is 44, so 30% is 3 times 44, which is 142. And then 90% of 460, 10% is 46, so 90% is 9 times 46, which is 414. To find 5% of a number, divide it by 10 and then divide it by 2. So for this one, we've got 140 divided by 10, which is 14. 14 divided by 2 is 7. So 5% of 140 is 7. Then we've got 5% of 260. So 260 divided by 10 is 26. Divide that by 2, which is 13. And then for the last one, I've converted my 1 metre 80 into 180 centimetres to make it a little bit easier. Then I've done 180 divided by 10, which is 18 centimetres. Divide that by 2, which is 9 centimetres. It says, how else could we work out 5%? So you could have said we could find 50% by dividing it by 2, and then we could divide it by 10, which would be 5%. So it's just basically doing the same. Instead of dividing by 10, then dividing by 2, you do divide by 2, then divide by 10. And then for the bottom ones, 15% of 60 metres, well 10% is 6, 5% is 3, so 15%, if you add those two together, is 9. For 35% of 300, you need to find 10%, which is 30, times that by 3 to find 30%. 5% is 15, so you add your 30% and your 5% together to get 105 grams. And then finally, for 65% of £20, we find 10%, which is 2, times it by 6, which is 12. 5% is 1, and then 60 add 5%, so 12 add 1 is 13. How many ways can you find 45% of 60? Ignore that little 20% at the bottom, that's not supposed to be there yet. So how many ways can you find 45% of 60 and use similar strategies to find 60% of 45? What do you notice? Does this always happen? And can you find any more examples? So the possible methods that you could do here to find 45%, you could do 10% times 4 plus 5%. You could find 25% and then 20% and add them together. Or you could find 25% and then 10%, add another 10%. Or you could find 50% and 5% and subtract the 5% from the 50%. To find 60% of 45, you could do 10% times 6, you could do 50% add 10%, or you could do 20% times 3. And it says, what do you notice? What you should have noticed there is that 45% of 60 is the same as 60% of 45. And it said, does this always happen? Yes, it does. So can you find any more examples? So you might have a range of examples there. So for example, 15% of 40 is the same as 40% of 15, and so on. So just make sure you've written at least 3 examples there for me. Okay, now if you found those challenging, just like yesterday, then by all means stop there if you think and your parents think that you've done enough for today. Or alternatively, you could have a 10 or 15 minute break. Or if you feel like you can carry on, carry straight on to the problem solving and reasoning. If these get too hard for you, don't get worked up, just stop and listen to the explanations instead. So Mo says to find 10% you divide by 10. So to find 50% you divide by 50. Do you agree? Explain why. Eva says to find 1% of a number you divide by 100. But Whitney says to find 1% of a number, you divide by 10 and then by 10 again. Who do you agree with? Explain your answer. And at the bottom, it wants you to complete the missing numbers. So 50% of 40 is the same as what percent of 80? What percent of 40 is the same as 1% of 400? And 10% of 500 is the same as what percent of 100? Have a go. So Mo is wrong. He says that to find 50% you divide by 50. We know that to find 50% we half it, and the reason for that is because 50% is equivalent to half, and a half means divide by 2. So Mo is wrong because 50% is equivalent to a half, so to find 50% you divide by 2. Eva says to find 1% of a number you divide by 100, and Whitney says that you divide it by 10 and 10 again. They're actually both correct. The only difference is Whitney split it down into 2 steps, so she's divided it by 10 and then 10 again, which ultimately is the same as dividing by 100, because 10 times 10 is 100. And then complete the missing numbers. So 50% of 40, which is 20, is the same as 25% or a quarter of 80. 10% of 40 is the same as 1% of 400, and 10% of 500 is the same as 50% of 100. So give yourselves a little tick if you got them right, or correct them if you didn't. Okay, last question. If you're struggling at this point, this one is a little bit more tricky, so you can finish if you're finding it a little bit too hard, but if you feel like you can have a go, then please do. Read the question and then have a go, and we'll go through the answers. Okay, so 350,000 people visited the Natural History Museum last week. 15% visited on Monday and 40% visited on Saturday. How many visited during the rest of the week? So between Monday and Saturday, that means 55% of people visited, because 15 add 40 is 55%. So that means that for the rest of the week, 45% visited. But it wants to know how many that is. So to find 45%, we need to find 10%, which is 35,000, times that by 4, which is 140,000. Then we need to find 5%. So if you go back to your 10% of 350,000 equals 35,000, and then divide that by 2, that gives you 17,500. So you've now got 5%. And then if you add your 40% and your 5% together, that gives you 147,500. The next question says, if 7 is 10% of a number, what is the number? Use the bar model if you need to help you. Well, basically we're doing the inverse. Normally to find 10% we would divide by 10. So working backwards to find 100%, or the original number, we would need to times by 10. So 7 times by 10 is 70. So the answer is 70. And then complete these. 10% of 150 equals 15. 30% of 300, 10% is 30, times it by 3 is 90. 30% of what is 45? So again we're going to do the inverse here. So we're going to do 45 divided by 3 equals 15, which would give you 10%. Then 15 times by 10 equals 150, which would give you 100%. You can check that answer by starting off with 150, finding 30% of it and see if it equals 45. And the same for the next question as well. So 900 divided by 3 equals 300, which is 10%, and then 300 times by 10 would be 3,000, which would give you 100%. And then again you can try it and see, so if you do 3,000 and find 30% of it, and your answer should be 900. Okay, so that's us done today. I hope it wasn't too much. Please give me some feedback and let me know if there's anything that I can do to improve my lessons, or if they're too easy, too hard, too fast, too slow. Anything at all feedback is greatly appreciated. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I shall speak to you tomorrow.